I'm Christina. My pronouns are she, her, hers, and I am a senior product designer at Drift. So you might know Drift for our chat tools, but more than that, we're building tools that focus on delivering personalized customer experiences in real time so that sales and marketing teams can accelerate revenue, shorten sales cycles, and just be human in the world of B2B selling. Even more important when we're all working from home these days. Specifically, I'm a designer on our teams that are focused on building for sales reps. So in terms of personalized buying experiences, the tools that I work on help sellers show their prospective buyers that there's a human on the other side of those cold emails. That's my main focus day to day. We work on small autonomous teams, so really most of my thinking revolves around the seller persona. But there is one more persona that I think about and build tools for just in a slightly different way. And that is design tools for our designers here at Drift. So in late 2018, I started spending some of my spare time at work contributing to Tide, which is our in-house design system. Since then, and without a dedicated design ops team yet, Tide has grown to be used in all of our products by over 20 designers. It now lives in Figma for us to use, and it's fully built out in code for engineers. And it's helped us reduce inconsistencies in our product with every single ship. And honestly, those success metrics are wild to me because I remember my first week at Drift, I sat down, I needed to ship my first design and I needed a button on the page. So I hit the R key, I drew a rectangle, I thought it looked pretty good with my text, and then I used the eyedropper to pull the green color that I had seen in a screenshot of some other buttons from another design. Let me be really clear. That design process, while it's not what we do today, allowed our tiny team back then to stay scrappy, ship fast, and start selling our product to some of our very first customers. So if that sounds like you right now, it's probably because your team or your company is growing and moving so fast that it just seems impossible to slow down enough to start maturing your design system and maturing your design process and building out that design system from scratch. And I want to be really realistic when I say that building Tide into this stable and self-sufficient system took us almost 3 years of on and off work when individual contributors had the bandwidth or the interest to work on it. Building and shipping new features for our customers was the #1 priority for our product team during that time, and it still is today. So the timeline I'm going to talk about is going to feel pretty long, and that's because it is. But I want to focus on 5 key milestones and the things that our team did at those points in the process of building out our design system that helped us get where we are today, which, spoiler alert here, is working on an update to our perfectly imperfect, but really more importantly, stable and usable design system. But first, when I say we going forward, I am referring to this incredible team of designers and UX researchers who have contributed to Tide over the past 3 years and use it day in and day out with their teams. So, give them a shout out in the chat. This team is awesome. And I couldn't tell you all about this without their help. So the first milestone that we hit when we were building out Tide is one that honestly felt really bad when we were in it. And that's identifying that we had a gap. So for our team, it was inconsistency. And I think that it felt really bad because it wasn't like we'd identified this problem that had sprung up overnight. It was something that I and my whole team, who I really, really respected, had contributed to over many days, weeks, and well-intentioned new features shipped. So in 2018, our product design team had tripled from 2 designers to 6 and then kept growing from there. And the shared and implicit design knowledge that worked when we were this small team just didn't scale with us. We played around a little bit at this point with Envision's design system manager, which you'll hear me refer to as DSM and the rest of this. So we did have some components and some colors documented there, but there wasn't any sort of formalized push to improve documentation because our team was growing. And I know that I'm phrasing this a little bit like it's a problem, but really our team scaling was this incredible opportunity to have 4 more fresh sets of eyes looking at all of our current processes. Basically, it meant that there were all these opportunities for someone to speak up and say, hey, maybe this is a silly question, but how do I use one textile versus another? Because I'm new, I don't know how. There we go, my slide didn't advance. There's my team. Another question we might have heard was, why are there 5 hex codes that all look the same as navy blue? But I don't think this is necessarily something that a new designer to the team has to bring to light. If you're curious about learning about some of your blind spots, you could sit down with a new PM or a new salesperson, or even better, a customer, and just have them talk out loud while they use your product for the first time. Watch for the places where they kind of pause or stumble over things and say like, that's weird. And fight the urge to be defensive there, because that is your jumping off point for design system. So for our team, those things were textiles, colors, and language. These were the places that we kept hearing that were confusing or unruly, or like probably honestly a little bit of both. So we dove in there to fully understand the magnitude of the updates that we were talking about making. Our UX researcher, Freya, started by creating inventories for each of those styles. And a lot of this early research work gave us almost a roadmap to start building our design system based on, because we found a lot of inconsistencies. In the color inventory alone, we found that we had been using at least 93 standalone colors across our app. 56 of them were what we called miscellaneous. So they weren't documented in code as variables. They weren't in DSM, which was pretty bare bones. And of those 56, 52, or most of them, could be replaced by an existing color. So they were probably results of what I was doing with the eyedropper on that button. So for each of them, we went through and we decided, which do we keep, which do we get rid of, and which do we update? And all of this was in service of building a palette that was based on a color role model that we had found and decided we wanted to emulate, and that was from Lyft's design system. And here's why I liked that role model. It really felt like our team could get there too. It was easy to look at our color inventory and feel overwhelmed. It was so far from perfect. I had no idea how we were ever going to use less than 93 colors. But the Lyft role model answered that by saying, you can have a lot of colors, but it just needs to be really clear where they came from and why you need to use them. So we set out to define those guidelines for our team too. Based on the color inventory, we created spectrums for all of the colors that we saw used the most. And we made sure that there was going to be a shade for big, important UI items, things like buttons, tags, avatars, that kind of thing. Also, at this point, we made sure to check all of those colors we were defining for accessibility. We learned this cool approach from the Lyft role model that made sure that all of the colors shade 50 and lighter were accessible on black, and everything shade darker than 50 was accessible on white. And we did have to adjust a little bit at this point because we realized we wanted to use our 50 shade mostly on white backgrounds. But luckily, we did that adjustment early on. And by doing this, we made sure that designers don't have to use contrast checkers on every single component and design that goes out the door from there on forward, because our colors are accessible. So as soon as we had colors and guidelines defined, we updated any component in DSM with the new colors. We still had a long way to go at this point, but at least new designs going out the door were not contributing to more inconsistencies. Looking back, I really see this time as pivotal for our design team, our system, and our product as a whole, because we had gotten started. And also, in the spirit of looking back and reflecting, I want to call out something I would do or not do again for every milestone that we hit. And in this case, it's something I would definitely do again. So once we had defined all of our new colors, we were super, super excited to start naming them really like fun and on-brand things. So we chose things like sticky note, I don't know why I said that weird, or canvas tote, which we didn't intend to rhyme. And at the time, it kind of felt like our bubble was burst when the engineer who was implementing these for us told us that the fun names weren't going to cut it. He said that if we ever needed to add or change colors down the road, it was going to be easier to name them based on the color family and the shade. So the color that was very briefly known as sticky note became Y20, or yellow in the 20 shade. Two huge reasons that I'm so glad we did this in the beginning. The first is that engineers can make educated and usually correct guesses on colors when they're moving fast. So for example, if we've established that button hover colors are always one shade darker than the main color, An engineer can easily implement B60 as a hover color because they know that B50 is the main button color. And then, like I hinted at a little bit before, we're in the very early stages of updating our design system. So now I can see that scenario where we change our colors and they no longer match those fun names that we decided on at first. But I do still like opening this Google sheet and reminiscing because we had a lot of fun doing that. So then after getting started on our design system, we really had this run book for how to continue unifying the rest of the pieces that designers and engineers used every day. We would conduct an audit to build out an inventory doc. We'd then make decisions on what we need to consolidate or update, and we'd identify the places that needed updating in the product, and we'd go do it. A misconception I had at this point was that it'd be pretty easy to manage the changes that we were making with our own designers, and then we would figure out how to do that with our engineers and other stakeholders. And I never questioned that our design team really wanted to make our product better, because they did, but it is hard to convince a team with processes that work to slow down, learn new guidelines, and learn their way around a new tool like DSM. And then it's even harder when there's a third party outside influence saying, hey, where's that feature? What about that design? Can we have it tomorrow? So this was a period of a lot of detached components and pushback from the team. I even remember at one point I pushed back, I dug my heels in, because based on our language audit, we had decided we were going to change all of our copy to use sentence case, but I liked title case. It's fine. I'm a sentence case fan now. Title case, I think, looks kind of, I don't know, I'm not used to it anymore. But still, we needed a way to ease designers like me and the rest of my team into these changes, so their ability to ship and make visible progress on their goals wasn't hindered in any way. So I can't take any credit for this solution, but what we came up with really kicked off a fun era for our design system here at Drift. We practiced. So for starters, our manager introduced the DDCC, or Drift Design Consistency Challenge. Little side note, I don't think we ever considered that someone like me was going to have to come up here and say that in a talk, but nonetheless, it made it really fun for our team to get the hang of the new design system. The idea was that every week, every designer would do a small design challenge. I think we had about 45 minutes or so to do it. And the prompts were things like organize a settings page onto cards, or put certain information into one of our new table components. And the stakes were super low. This was all just to learn. We would then get feedback videos on our work, and eventually we ended up rotating who set the prompt and who reviewed submissions each week. And don't get me wrong, engineers needed the push to get on board too. We just focused on designers at first because we were starting small. Over time, we expanded our fun rituals to include the rest of our team so that we were all getting in our reps and sets using the design system, both in Figma, well, Sketch at the time, and in code. One ritual that was critical to paying down our experience debt and inconsistencies was our weekly UXU competition, or user experience updates. So every week, a designer would conduct an audit of the product, and they'd assign tickets for inconsistencies to teams that owned specific product areas. Those are usually pretty low-hanging fruit, things like replace a one-off instance of an element with one of our new components, or swap out a font for the bold typeface rather than letting the browser make it bold. So really small things. Any tickets that were completed in the week were entered into a drawing to win coffee to share with the engineer who we worked with on it. And while this was quirky for sure, I think the process is just the embodiment of progress over perfection. Change is hard, and sweeping change in one go is really unrealistic for a team at a rapidly growing company. And the outcome of our brick by brick approach, like the DDCC and UXUs, was that the design team was not only bought in, but we established ourselves as 7 fiercely passionate advocates for Tide and design consistency throughout our entire build process. Slowly, we gained momentum by making engineers advocates as well. I still have engineers on my team today who will talk about how they've found an UXU and they're going to fix it, but it's all on their own. They don't need me to assign them tickets from an audit first, and that is fantastic. Something from this milestone that I would love to solve a little bit sooner if we did it all again is that our fun rituals made contributing to and using our design system feel a little bit like this extra or optional thing because they were incentivized right off the bat. In the long term, we want our whole team to view the Tide design system as this integral piece of building our product that allows us to stay consistent and move fast on small autonomous teams. When new team members come on board now, I really see that sentiment taken as true a lot more quickly than with the folks who were part of this milestone when we needed to get our practice in. But I don't see that as a failure in any way. It just made it tougher to transition away from these rituals as we matured. There's definitely a middle ground here, and I'm excited to come back to a Ladies at UX talk and hear that someone on this call has solved it. So while there was this really clear-cut period where we worked for designer and engineer buy-in in the previous milestone, I actually think that stakeholder buy-in, so director level and above, is actually happening all the time. So back at the beginning of this talk, I mentioned that the timeline I'm talking about was going to seem long because it is, but that's in hindsight, right? We didn't set out building a design system and ask our stakeholders to commit to being on board like with no hesitations for the next 3 years. As we worked and as our system grew and evolved, we needed to show our work and prove the value of Tide to stakeholders continuously. Our engineering leaders cared about code quality, speed to build, and technical consistency across our features. Our product leaders care about speed to ship and impact on timelines, goals, and how our customers use the product. And then our company leaders care about the impact on business goals, but above all, they really need to see that we're not just making pretty updates, but contributing to an improved experience for our customers, both current and future. So pay attention to what those leaders are rallying around when they talk to your org or your company and use those themes to your advantage. After about a year of us working on Tide, it was definitely coming time to renew buy-in. At that point, we don't want leadership to say, hey, what did you do all last year? And why are you still working on this? So our company all hands comes around in early 2020, and our CEO's talk is all about how Drift reduces friction for B2B buyers. And so after that, reducing friction is this big company-wide theme, and everyone's really excited about it. And we hopped on that as fast as we could because continuing to work on our design system was all in order to reduce friction for our users. I talked a little bit about this before, but our jumping off point again was the uncomfortable work of showing just how much friction there still was in the product, even after a year of progress. So while we were tracking a raw number of inconsistencies in those biweekly product audits, a more impactful quantitative measurement that we had started using a little bit before this, but around the same time, was SEQ, or the single use of use question. This asks users how difficult or easy Drift is to use on a scale of 5, where 5 is very easy. That survey also included a comment section that helped us gather some qualitative feedback at the same time. Now, SEQ is a baseline here, and it can be affected by all sorts of things. So we don't expect that all of the feedback would be directly tied to friction caused by design inconsistencies. But looking back at all of the data we've collected, we do see that 5% of all of our improvement theme comments have been related to usability of the UI. So we hear comments like, the interface isn't always intuitive, or it's a little clunky and difficult to navigate at times. And 2020 was the year that we got really loud about sharing out this data and advocating for product teams to use it even more broadly. So they could use it to test the usability of their own workflows or to measure OKRs every quarter. Our incredible researcher, Freya, has been leading that charge ever since, sharing out these awesome summaries you see here and helping teams and product leadership implement it more broadly. And the outcome we see is that when stakeholders come to us asking why we might be pushing a timeline to make Tide improvements, or when product feedback gets escalated all the way up, we as designers can say, yep, we know about this, and here's why we're going to fix it. Here's what we're going to do. By getting loud and tying our work to the numbers that relate directly back to the customer, we have stakeholders' trust and buy-in to slow down when we need that. But we also have a lot of opportunities for leadership to tell us that maybe we should pause work or phase out rituals because design system work isn't a top priority at the moment, or they think we're good on that front. So with that said, definitely start measuring early. We have over 2 years of historic SEQ data at this point, and it's even a metric that's now reported on monthly and shared company-wide. So then rallying around that friction theme in 2020 was honestly the year that Tide really grew up. For most of 2019, we were ripping and replacing old elements so that we could really reap the benefits of a design system where we'd make one change and see it applied everywhere. We did this both in code and in design. By early 2020, we had moved over fully from Sketch to Figma and had this really robust library built out and being used by the team. But what's left to do once you've ripped and replaced everything? It was time to start removing bigger areas of friction. So this milestone was where we saw a shift from working on components to working on patterns. After ripping and replacing individual elements with new shiny Tide components, the app still kind of looked like we had shipped our org chart. I mentioned that we work on these small autonomous teams, but ideally the customer knows nothing about that. We had reached this critical mass of raw components and they were being used correctly by designers and engineers, but teams were still shipping different solutions to the same problems. So I see a lot of our components in use here in these filtering patterns, but they're not solving the bigger picture problem, is that our design team needs to stay in sync about how we use these components on a page together. So we implemented 2 ways of staying close. We have now design only components in Figma, and we started meeting with these Tide Design Weekly meetings. So a new filtering pattern became the first design only component, meaning that it just exists in Figma for designers to use. And engineers won't have that exact component in code, but they will have all the right pieces to make it work. These kind of components ensure that 2 teams who are building similar functionality can make it look and feel the same, regardless of any logic that engineering needs to implement to make it work in context. As we grow, I definitely could see us adding things like the filtering card to our component library built out in code. But for now, design-only components allow us to keep moving fast without the overhead of making sure that complex components are generalized enough in code to be used anywhere. And then Tide Design Weekly gave us a forum to come together and talk about new patterns, talk about changes to components or difficult things to use in the current system. This gives us a place to say, here's the way we're going to design filtering going forward, and here's the component you can use so you don't need to think about it. It's also a place to come and say, hey, those modals that we shipped last month, it requires way too much thought for me to use them, and it's too hard. And both of those topics are not only okay, they're encouraged here. However, if I could go back in time to those meetings where we all brought topics and excitedly discussed as a group, I would definitely document all of our decisions directly within our Figma library files. Over this time, we scattered a lot of knowledge really all over the place. Some things in Slack, some things in our internal wiki, some things only in the meeting notes. And still to this day, we're hearing a lot of questions about why something in the system was done historically or how something should be used. And we don't have clear documentation around it because no one sitting there in those meetings thought we'd forget. Hindsight is 2020. So now we're living in this last milestone. We're in a place where our design system just works. And I hope that everything I talked through shows you that while it works for us, it's nowhere near perfect. I mean, I just admitted that we thought decisions made in meetings could stay documented in our brains as recently as last year, probably even more recently. But another thing I can't remember is the last time that I argued with an engineer over a basic component not looking quite right. Tide works. And when I say that, I mean it allows designers and engineers to move faster and implement consistent and trusty UI. But here's the thing, I haven't designed a component in months, and that feels weird. So I thought I'd walk through a few of the things I hear from the design team now that tell me that's actually okay. The first telltale sign that things have stabilized is that our design library in Figma doesn't change too often anymore. A year ago, I was nervous about creating a formalized design system onboarding deck because I knew I was just going to have to remake it anytime a new designer started because we just were rapidly shipping changes. Now I've onboarded 4 new team members with an onboarding deck that lives in Figma, and I've only ever had to accept minor changes that were caused by updates to auto layout or the introduction of variants. And then at meetings like Tide Design Weekly, we start to hear themes like, I don't know how to properly use this component that I found in the library. Honestly, the conversations we used to have were a lot harder. They're around like detaching components and one-off instances of things that we intended to be used out of the box. This shift in theme that we hear now tells us we have a documentation problem. We don't have an adoption problem. If we're 3 years in and talking about needing to implement DDCCs again, I'd be really worried. But instead, we know we can work in small bursts to write down everything that we implicitly know about the system and have more conversations about the things we don't use so often. And then similarly, where changes to the system used to feel pretty urgent and potentially were blocking to designers when they needed to ship features, the feedback we hear about our components, thankfully, is no longer along the lines of, this component is broken, or it doesn't exist and I really need it, or I found two, which one do I use? And now our designers are giving really thoughtful feedback about how a design system could help them move even faster with things like better layer naming conventions or additional variants. Simply put, most of the feedback we hear now are nice to haves, not need to haves or blockers. So if Tide is stable enough, what's next then? Besides like our obvious need for documentation, we're getting there, I promise. Well, we are doing it all again. We are ready for minor updates to Tide that are going to carry our product into the next 5 to 10 years and beyond. Will this iteration be perfect? Will we follow these milestones I just talked about as a recipe for going forward? I think yes and no. I feel really empowered to start again because I know we have nothing to lose. We have an SEQ score to improve. We have documentation to write. And excitingly, we have a system in place to iterate on instead of starting from scratch. But if we'd never started from scratch, wouldn't it be even scarier now? And so my call to action for all of you is do one thing this week that pushes your big, messy, nebulous project forward. I assume if you just listen to all of this, you're probably also working on a design system, but you can do it on any project, really. Start an audit. I always like doing them on Thursdays and Fridays anyway, so you have the rest of this week. Or go out on a limb and call together a squad to help you rally around this quirky new idea for a ritual you have. It's never going to be the right time to start building your design system. So what is stopping you from diving in right now or tomorrow? It's after hours right now. And then one more plug before we get to questions. We are hiring at Drift. So if you want to do all of this again with us, we currently have open roles for senior and staff product designers, as well as senior UX researchers. Maybe you want to be someone who partners with our awesome design team. There are also roles open for engineers and product managers as well. We're also now a digital first company, so you don't need to be located in Boston for one of these roles. We have drifters all across the country. Everything I just mentioned, all of those open roles can be found at drift.com/careers. And that is all I have. So I will thank you for listening and open it up to questions.
Thank you so much, Christina. If folks have questions, please feel free to put them in the chat and we'll make sure that Christina gets them. We have about 15 minutes for questions right now. I can kick things off while folks are getting their questions ready. So Christina, I'm curious how you would recommend like getting started with a design.
Ooh, good question. Well, I talked a lot about those audits and the inventories that we made to get started. And I think that starting with color was the right choice. Obviously, we had a big color inconsistency problem, but like think about the things that you see day to day and are like maybe not so proud of or confuse your engineers or confuse you, and like just write everything down and see where your biggest problem areas are, and then you can tackle fixing it, but like you have to know what the problem is first so you could get started there.
Thank you. All right, we've got a question in the chat from Alexa. What is the #1 thing you felt was helpful in advocating for the value of Tide during the initial change period?
Oh, I like that question too. The change was hard, honestly. I hope that came across. It was a lot of change for us to deal with. And I keep bringing up these inventories that we did, but I think just like putting the problems that we were seeing on paper and showing that to engineers and leadership really helped make the problem that I think like a lot of the designers just felt a lot more real. And it felt bad. Like, I'm not going to say that finding 93 colors felt good. But it definitely helped us advocate for spending time on this because we had a pretty obvious problem. And then advocating with engineers, just kind of all in the process, was also hard. And I think I really framed it on my own teams as like, we can move so much faster once we implement Tide. I was working on a product at the time that we had acquired, and so it wasn't using the same code base. I don't totally understand the specifics, but it was harder for us to use Tide at first. And so the big thing I had to advocate for was like, it's worth doing some code cleanup so that we can implement this. And it's gonna, like, I'm designing using Tide components, whether or not we can use them in code. So it's gonna help us move a lot faster if we can implement those things right out of the box like other teams are doing.
Thank you, Christina. All right, we had a few other questions that that Taylor answered in the chat. We have one here from Marissa, who asks, did you have a team of designers and or engineers dedicated to the initial design system setup? How did you get buy-in from engineering?
Yeah, good question. We didn't have a dedicated team. We haven't had any like design ops team working on this. It's just been like a tiger team of people who have had interest or bandwidth to be able to do it. So I've been working on it pretty closely, and a few other designers also were working on getting it off the ground at first. And then over time, we've also gained like those same advocates on the engineering side. So they've been super helpful to, I know they have like front end meetings where there are design system advocates on the engineering side there who just like go into those and are on our side, which feels really good. And sorry, I see the, and how do we get buy-in from engineering? It was hard, and it was a lot of like kind of what I just said of just trying to say, this is going to help us move faster. This is how we're designing already. So we hope you can get on board too. And then building those advocates of engineers who are going to understand our same mission and rally behind it with us.
Cool, thanks, Christina. All right, we've got a couple more questions coming in here. So Rick says, thank you for the talk. My question, do you use a tool for live component hosting, for example, Storybook, with separate usage instruction, or are the components built into their own app or site, maybe along with usage instructions?
Yeah, I don't know what ours is called. I know I've heard of Storybook before. I don't know if that's what we're using, but there is a site that our engineers can go to and see examples of everything. I think that our documentation could be a lot better on there of like how exactly to use them. And one issue that we ran into maybe about a year ago is that engineers were taking our designs and naming them something very different from what we had been calling them in Figma. And so there are some discrepancies in that live code portion between like what they're named, which can run into some problems. We've tried to get everything on the same page. So if we call it that in the code library, we're calling it the same thing in Figma. But it is not, I did want to say, it's not publicly visible. That's one of our future goals for sure. So just internally available for engineers.
Cool, great questions. So Graham is asking, we have started to add research links to our components and patterns in our design system in order to validate our decisions and encourage developers to adopt the design system. Do you use any other methods to encourage engineering adoption?
I love that. I love hearing that you're doing that. I think we could do a much better job of that. We've grown our research team from 1 to 2 researchers in the past year. And I think that as we move into updating our system, we can do a lot more rigorous testing to see how things perform, how they're perceived. I think a good example right now is like, we have this disabled button style and we're kind of like, it's not accessible. Like, do we even need it? I think before we make that decision to get rid of it, probably should do some testing around that. And I would love to link it to encourage adoption of our design system. But I kind of mentioned this now, I mean, we're rapidly growing. Now the engineers who join the team, there's a lot less skepticism about using the system because the initial set of engineers is bought in. So I know we're lucky in that regard, but it's not so much an ongoing battle for adoption as much as it used to be.
All right, any other questions for Christina?
Thank you, Taylor, for in the chat saying it's not Storybook.
Yeah. All right, so Lara asks, how are new engineers onboarded to using the design system?
Oh, that's a good question. I can only speak to the ones that have joined my team, but this has worked well for me, is sitting down with engineers and just explaining why we do the things in our system that we do. So early on, I was fighting this battle of like, my engineers wouldn't use the 8-pixel multiple spacing. Like it was always 10 or something random. So I sat down and just explained why we do it and explained that like any spacing I ever use is going to be a multiple of 8. And it was like a light bulb went off. They got it then. It just was a matter of like, here are all these decisions that we worked really hard to make, and we hope you'll be excited about them too. I don't know, Taylor, do you know anything about like any formalized onboarding to it? I do think it's happening at like a team level.
Thanks.
Sorry, not to make you come off mute.
No, I couldn't unmute myself, so that was fancy. I've never seen that before. So I don't think we have any formalized onboarding for engineers, but we have internal champions that we have both found early on in the process and really built those internal champions on the engineering side. As Christina mentioned, our UXU raffle, I think, really did a great job at building those champions on the engineering side as well, and then aligning those back to the goals that Christina mentioned as well, that the engineers really care about. Yeah. So I think right now, like we're at a point where it makes so much sense. It's just part of like working at Drift as an engineer. This is just part of the system that you use now, because it helps our engineers work more efficiently as well and reduce a lot of back and forth. So I think getting that buy-in and building those champions was pretty critical there.
Yeah, and one thing lately that I've noticed is we're pushing this big effort to scale our product to be used internationally. And so we've had to update some older code repos into a new version. I don't know, not my wheelhouse, but the new version is where Tide can be used. And so there's a huge driver with the international work to update code so we can use Tide. But then what I found is that like engineers who are working on that are so excited that they can use Tide, and so excited that these old pages that have never used it before can suddenly be updated, and they can do a lot of it on their own because they see the old versions of like inputs and drop downs and all sorts of things, and they know exactly what to use in the new Tide library. So it's been so cool to see that unfolding and like see them excited about like migrating code so that they can use Tide.
That's amazing, Christina. Thank you for sharing that. Thank you, Taylor. We have a question from Sebastian here. How did you manage versions? We are currently updating our design system while at the same time developing.
Great question. I think that is something for us to figure out in this new update that we're working on. Since we've been a small design team most of the time that we've been using it, we haven't had to do much versioning on the design side. And then I know on the engineering side, versioning can be a little messy. I'll say that. Just with like changes going out. I think one time one of our big changes was like we had new modals that we wanted everybody to use, but everyone had to upgrade their version of Tide that was running in their code base. So I don't think we have a great solution to that today, and would love to figure it out in our next iteration.
Joan asks, oh, yep, all right, never mind. Taylor got that one. All right, from Celine. Thank you so much for this talk. How do you prove the work you're doing on Tide is making an impact? Also, since there's always so much opportunity with design systems, how do you prioritize what to focus on?
Yeah, good question. Our SEQ surveys, so what I talked about in the talk, largely we were asking how easy or hard is it to use Drift overall. We're now moving towards TSEQ or transactional SEQ to measure the usability of just certain workflows. And so that's been cool because my own team can see what the things that we ship, like how usable are they after we ship them. I mean, we've gone through user testing before it gets shipped, but then, getting the raw feedback after it goes out is always awesome. And so then, because we don't have a dedicated design ops team, if I were to find something that came out of that survey from my area of the product, like the filtering example I gave was something that I worked on. If we find that it's not performing well, or we're getting bad feedback on it, or people just straight up don't know how to use it, that's something that I would then take on. I'd probably bring it to a TIE Design Weekly meeting and say, hey, I think I'm going to update this pattern because we've heard that it's really hard to use in our TSEQ for our area of the app, which helps me prioritize. But then as a team, it's been cool to watch, like as we start to update, trying to figure out what we prioritize first. And I think we really looked to like the areas where some of our new designers have said, I have no idea how to use this thing. So we're working on colors again. We're taking away some of our giant spectrum of colors because we found that there just aren't, we don't use all of them. So new designers are kind of where we're leaning for overall changes to figure out what needs to be updated.
Awesome. Thanks, Christina. All right, so we've got, looks like that might be the end of the questions, which is great because we are just about at time. So we'll end out with this comment from Mona. She says, that was an amazing session, truly enjoyed it and learned a lot. Thanks for the amazing insights and learning, which I think represents everything very well. So thank you so much, Christina. It was such a great presentation. We learned a ton from you. Thank you to Drift. And thank you everyone for attending, and we look forward to seeing you again in the future at our next event.